People talk about Richard the Lionheart as if he was the perfect English king, a hero who rode into battle with a gleaming sword and a roaring lion stitched onto his chest. But the truth is a bit stranger, because Richard spent so little time in England that most of the people who praised him never actually saw him. It's almost like someone becoming famous for ruling a kingdom they barely walked through. He was born into royalty, brought up on songs of glory and stories about ancestors who fought for honor. And he grew up believing that real greatness was earned, somewhere far beyond the borders of his own land. For him, England was not really home. It was more like the treasury that funded his adventures. Richard's childhood didn't feel like the quiet, sheltered upbringing you might expect for a future king. His family was constantly fighting within itself. His father, King Henry II, was powerful and clever, but his sons were ambitious and restless, and each of them believed they deserved more than they were being given. Richard was not the oldest brother, but he had the most natural fire in him. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women of the medieval world, filled his mind with ideas of chivalry and knightly honor. She had her own storms with Henry II, and she often pushed her sons to rebel against their father. It was a family where loyalty shifted like sand. Richard learned early that power was not something gently handed down. It had to be won, taken, or fought for. Even before he was king, he was leading armies, not in England, but in the lands. He cared about far more: France, Aquitaine, Normandy. These places shaped him much more than the island kingdom he would one day rule and name. He was tall, confident, and fearless, and people said he had the natural presence of a warrior. That strength made men follow him and also made kings fear him. When Henry II finally died and Richard became king, the people of England celebrated. But Richard didn't stay long enough to enjoy any of it. He was already thinking about the Crusades, about Jerusalem, and about the grand idea of rescuing the Holy Land. To him, that seemed more important than sitting on a throne or learning the day-to-day struggles of the people he ruled. Within months of becoming king, he was preparing ships, gathering soldiers, and emptying money from England to fund his journey. It is strange to imagine a king so admired for leading a kingdom he barely stepped foot in. But that was Richard. The Crusades were harsh, bloody, and filled with long stretches of nothing followed by sudden moments that could decide hundreds of lives in an instant. When Richard arrived in the Holy Land, he quickly gained a reputation as someone who did not hesitate. His bravery was real, and even his enemies admitted it. Stories spread of him riding straight into danger, sometimes almost recklessly, as if proving himself mattered more than surviving. That kind of courage made people worship him, but it also made him unpredictable. Facing him on the other side of the conflict was Saladin, a leader who had earned his place through skill and discipline, not birth. What made the two men's rivalry unusual was the deep respect they had for each other, even though their armies fought fiercely. Richard and Saladin exchanged gifts, messages, and compliments. It was almost like the two of them existed in a separate world of honor. While everyone around them struggled with disease, hunger, and the exhausting weight of war, Richard had moments of incredible strength. But he also made decisions that showed how imperfect he was. There were times when prisoners were executed because negotiations did not go his way. There were battles that cost lives simply because he wanted to prove a point. He was brave, yes, but he was also stubborn, and pride sometimes guided his hand more than reason. Still, his soldiers believed in him because he stood in the same dangers they faced. He didn't hide behind walls or command from a distance. He was always there, at the front, sword in hand. The more time Richard spent in the Holy Land, the farther England felt. The people back home were dealing with their own problems, high taxes, political schemes, and the growing influence of Richard's brother, John. Because Richard was gone for so long, John found plenty of opportunities to grab power. He made deals, whispered into the ears of nobles, and tried to reshape England to his advantage. Meanwhile, Richard's absence drained the kingdom's resources. It was almost ironic that the king who inspired so much admiration was hardly there for the people paying the price. After years of fighting, Richard realized he could not take Jerusalem. No matter how many victories he won, the odds were against him. Both armies were exhausted, and continuing the fight would have meant thousands more deaths. So he agreed to a compromise with Saladin. Christians would be allowed safe passage to the city. Even though Richard would not rule it, it was not the glorious triumph he had hoped for, but it was a practical choice, and it showed something rare for him: restraint. The journey home should have been simple, but Richard's life never followed the easy path. On his way back to England, he was captured by a rival who demanded a massive ransom. It was humiliating for a king to be held like a hostage, but that is exactly what happened. England, already stretched thin, now had to raise even more money to free him. Ordinary people sold livestock, tools, and sometimes even land just to help bring Richard home. A king who had barely lived in the kingdom was now costing them more than ever. And yet, somehow, they still called him a hero. That is the strange part about Richard the Lionheart. He was loved not because of what he did for England, but because of the stories told about him. He became larger than life, almost mythic, like someone out of a tale rather than a man who made mistakes, bled in battle, and caused hardships without fully realizing it. His bravery was real, but so were the consequences of his choices. And even before he returned home, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Richard had become famous for ruling a kingdom he had barely bothered to rule. When Richard finally made it back to England after being held captive for more than a year, the kingdom he returned to didn't feel much like his own. Most kings spend their reign inside their borders, learning how their people live, what they struggle with, and what they expect from their ruler. But Richard had been gone so long that England felt almost like a place he had rented, rather than a home he was returning to. People crowded the streets to see him, cheering for their warrior king. But those cheers didn't erase the damage his absence had caused. Taxes had gone up to pay for his release. John had been stirring up trouble, and many people were tired of sacrificing for a man who seemed more interested in foreign battles than in the well-being of those who lived under his crown. Yet Richard returned with the same energy and determination he had always carried. He forgave John far more easily than most kings would have, in part because he knew John wasn't strong enough to truly threaten him, and in part because Richard simply didn't care enough about English politics to stay angry. He dealt with a few rebellious nobles, re-established his authority, and made sure everyone remembered that he was still the Lionheart. It didn't take long for him to restore control, but even then, it wasn't the throne or the crown that excited him. Richard still believed that adventure, warfare, and glory mattered more than ruling a quiet, stable kingdom. Within months of restoring order, he left England again. This time he went back to France, where most of his real interests and responsibilities were. Richard was not just the king of England. He controlled massive lands across France, and to him, those lands were more important than anything across the Channel. England was the place that provided him money. France was the place that shaped him, challenged him, and gave him a sense of identity. He spent the last years of his life fighting in France to protect those territories from rivals, who were just as ambitious as he had once been as a young prince. Even in his later wars, Richard fought with the same intensity he had shown during the Crusades. He inspected fortresses, built new defenses, and rode into danger the way he always had. People close to him sometimes said he behaved as if he were invincible, as if the idea of dying in battle was something that only happened to ordinary men. His confidence was part of his charm, but also part of his downfall. In 1199, while leading a siege against a minor rebel in a small French castle, Richard rode too close to the walls. A defender fired a crossbow bolt that struck him in the shoulder. At first, it didn't seem deadly. Doctors tried to remove the bolt, but medieval medicine was often worse than the wound itself. The injury became infected, and slowly, the strongest warrior king of his age began to slip away. As he lay dying, people around him were stunned. This was Richard the Lionheart, the man who had charged into battle against Saladin, the man who had survived storms, sieges, betrayal, and captivity. It didn't feel right for him to die from something as small as a single arrow fired by someone whose name would be forgotten. But that's how life works sometimes. Legends don't always end in grand moments. Sometimes the end comes quietly, in a dimly lit tent, far from crowds. far from the kingdom that had sacrificed so much for a king who barely lived there. Richard was only 41 when he died. His body was treated like that of a hero, divided and buried in separate holy places, a practice reserved for important leaders. His heart went to Rouen, his body to Fontevraud Abbey next to his parents, and his organs were buried at the place where he died. These strange traditions reflected how many different worlds he belonged to: French, English, royal, crusader, warrior, legend. And yet, through all of it, he had never actually taken the time to rule in the way a king usually does. England had paid for his ambitions, had suffered while he chased glory, and had waited for a king who was almost never there. After his death, John, the brother Richard had once forgiven, became king. John was nothing like Richard. He lacked courage, charisma, and the respect of the people. Strangely enough, the contrast between them made Richard look even more heroic in memory. People forgot his mistakes, forgot the taxes, forgot how little time he spent in England. They held onto the stories of the Crusades, the tales of his bravery, the image of him riding with his sword raised high. Over the years, that image hardened into myth, and the legend of Richard the Lionheart grew far beyond the real man. The oddest part is that Richard's reputation in England was built almost entirely on imagination. Most ordinary people in his kingdom never saw him, never heard his voice, and never benefited from his decisions. But stories have power. They travel from village to village, told by travelers, sung by poets, copied by monks. People love the idea of a king who fought like the heroes in old tales, even if he didn't spend much time caring for his kingdom. It was easier to admire a distant legend than to face the complicated truth of what his reign actually meant. Richard's life raises a strange question. What does it really mean to be a great king? Is it about ruling wisely, helping your people, and building a stable kingdom? Or is it about winning battles, inspiring legends, and being remembered for extraordinary courage? Richard excelled at the second and struggled with the first. He was not a builder, not a reformer, not a ruler who changed laws or strengthened institutions. He was a warrior who saw the world through the eyes of a knight searching for honor. In many ways, he belonged more to the battlefield than to the throne. And yet, it is impossible to deny the force of his character. Even today, centuries later, his name still carries weight. When people imagine a medieval king, they often picture someone like Richard, tall, fearless, riding into the heart of danger with a sword flashing in the sun. The reality of his reign was far more complicated, but the myth of the Lionheart is something that refuses to fade. In the end, Richard remains one of history's great paradoxes, a king celebrated by a kingdom he barely ruled, a hero remembered more for stories than for leadership, and a man who chased glory so far from home that he never truly understood the place he was meant to govern. But maybe that is exactly why his legend survived. He lived like a character out of an epic, and history tends to remember those who shine brightly, even if only for a moment, rather than those who ruled quietly and carefully. It is hard to say whether Richard the Lionheart was a good king in the practical sense, but he was unforgettable, and sometimes human memory chooses wonder over accuracy. That is why the world still speaks his name not as the king who ruled England, but as the warrior who never stopped trying to carve his legacy into the world, no matter how far he had to ride from the throne that was supposed to be his home.